Tim's a former BBC journalist and the principal of South College at Durham University. Tim, it's good to have you on the programme. And the reason that you're here to talk to me today is to respond to the news that the BBC has said that its news and current affairs journalists and teams, producers, directors, presenters must not attend the anti-Semitism march, let me just stress, a march against anti-Semitism, that is taking place in London on Sunday. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think the BBC has probably rather overreacted to what should have been a relatively straightforward decision. After all, opposing anti-Semitism is to oppose an obnoxious form of racism, and I'm sure that the BBC is not in support of racism. Of course, what has happened is that the BBC has conflated a march against anti-Semitism with the controversy over the war between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I think that's a mistake. I think that BBC journalists are quite capable of going on a march, showing their hostility to an obnoxious form of racism without in any way engaging in debate about that controversy. And of course, the BBC has to remain impartial in the instance of the war. But why it feels it has to remain impartial in an issue of anti-Semitism, I do not understand. And I do think that is a miscalculation.
Does anyone have to explain why it is the BBC feels it must remain impartial when the issue at hand, as you quite rightly say, is racism, pure and simple? I mean, it's illegal in this country, it's immoral, we don't countenance it, nobody does. And it's not as if there's a countermarch that you can go on that's legal, which is pro-racism. So if there is no counter to it, if there's no naysaying it in any terms, then how could they not be proud and honoured and delighted that BBC staff should want to take part in a march against racism?
The only explanation I can offer, Vanessa, is that the BBC thinks that this will become a controversial march, that it will become an event at which the real issue will be a discussion between those who support Israel's stance in the war with Hamas and those who support the Palestinian or the Hamas case. Now, my position on that is very straightforward. I am 100% pro-Israel. This march, however, is not supposed to be about that issue. I think the BBC fears that it will be hijacked by that issue, and that is probably why they are being so sensitive. As I've said, I think BBC journalists are intelligent. I think they're capable of making a clear distinction in their own minds. I think even if that march were to be hijacked by people who want to talk about something else, BBC journalists have the intelligence, the gumption and the good sense to stick to the core theme and say, look, we are protesting against a vile form of racism. Anti-Semitism is a vile form of racism. It was something advanced by Adolf Hitler. If we cannot object to anti-Semitism, to what can we as civilized human beings object? That would certainly be my stance, but the BBC is intensely sensitive at the moment. It is facing criticism from both sides over its coverage of the war in Gaza, and it is feeling sensitive. In my opinion, and as a BBC executive, I always used to think that if I was being criticised by both sides, I was probably getting something absolutely right.
Yes, I mean, when I've been discussing this today, during the day, and with my team and with various other people, knowing that we were going to be talking about it on the programme, some people have countered and said, well, actually, BBC journalists aren't allowed, for example, to march in the Pride March, not allowed to take part in the Gay Pride March. And I hadn't known that was true. Is that true, do you think?
No, I don't think that is true. And I think that it was regarded as perfectly appropriate that BBC staff should march in the Pride March. After all, it's not a political issue. It's an issue of human rights. And I regard protesting against anti-Semitism as an issue of human rights as well. As I say, they have got this decision wrong, but I understand the intense sensitivity around the issues aroused by the war that has probably led BBC decision makers to make what is in this case a very strange and probably wrong-headed decision. Well, intensely wrong-headed decision, in my opinion.
Had the BBC decreed that staff could not join the Black Lives Matter protest that took place during lockdown, had the BBC said that it didn't want staff, presenters, producers, and everybody else to take part in that demonstration?
This ban, as I understand it, or this advice which has been offered to news and current affairs journalists, i.e. people involved in the coverage of events in the Middle East, or involved in the making of news programmes and current affairs programmes. So it doesn't extend to all BBC staff, as I understand it. And the BBC has always been very careful in the past to make a distinction between issues which are clearly human rights issues and issues which are seen to be politically partisan. Now, one can quite clearly understand that whilst Black Lives Matter is an anti-racism campaign, it is an anti-racism campaign which comes from a particular perspective. It adopts the values of critical race theory. Now, you can be opposed to racism without accepting critical race theory. So there is a degree of contention about that issue, but there is nothing remotely contentious, in my opinion, nothing at all, not an iota of contention in the opposition to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism murdered 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. It is one of the most vile forms of prejudice one can possibly advance. And to be opposed to a march against anti-Semitism is, I think, a bad position for BBC management to have placed themselves in. I hope they'll change their minds.